Hey, this is Ghost Robo, and today we have a look at each and every boss from the new Kirby game, a Kirby's Epic Yarn boss gauntlet, if you will. So we're going to start off with Fangora here, who is the boss of Grassland, and he is a very cool looking large dragon. A lot of these bosses are very easy, and as you'll see, can be beaten in 60 seconds, or roughly right around there, a minute or two. But I wanted to talk about some of my favorite bosses and sort of the current state of bosses. Some of the most recent AAA titles. I think that, as games get more and more open-ended and lifelike, the whole sort of concept of boss just kind of flies right out the window. If you look at all the old favorites from the NES or even, SNES and even to a degree the, PS1, N64 era, bosses were prevalent in almost every action game, every adventure game, every RPG. And while you still have definite defined bosses in most RPGs nowadays, but isolated bosses have pretty much vanished from every other genre. If you think back to like Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, one of my favorite games with some of my favorite bosses, you enter a room, get a quick little cutscene, and there's the boss. And you just don't see that very much anymore. Look at a game like Bioshock. The big days are quote-unquote the bosses, but they're roaming all over the level. There's no real set, oh, here comes the big bad boss. It's just, he's in the environment. And as graphical engines get more and more powerful and games can handle so much more on screen, you can have humongous enemies that just become commonplace as opposed to a special encounter. And in some ways, I don't like that at all. I don't like going through a game without a big major villain or a big major encounter. I don't think it's for every game. In Fallout New Vegas, look at that. Would that be great if you fought some ginormous, Las Vegas monster at the end of the game? No. But for a lot of other titles, I think it'd be good to have some bosses. And so some of my favorite bosses, here we have Hot Wings the bird from the second world. Some of my favorite bosses from recent memory are probably a lot of the guys in Metal Gear Solid 4. Especially the Metal Gear fights, I thought those were really great, and some of the one-on-ones against Vamp and the Raiden Vamp battle where you've got it going back and forth, the screen split in half, and it's really dynamic. I think that if you can make an encounter something more than tiny you fighting giant dude, which seemed to be the pattern of the 8 and 16 and 64-bit eras, I think bosses can create some really memorable moments. And I know that right now the big thing is sort of, memorable moments that just happen out of thin air. If you look at games like Red Dead Redemption, Fallout New Vegas, Fable 3, all these more open world titles, open-ended titles that the fun and the quote-unquote Kodak moment just happens at random and is different for every person. That's great, but there's something to say for having a boss that you could talk to your friends about, or everybody that played the game had experienced that same great moment. Castlevania, Lords of Shadow, the new one, that has some really good bosses. They do a great job of having one-on-one fights where you're not, at times you're fighting huge guys, but you're not always fighting, the giant towering beasts, and that's some really good combat. God of War has some great bosses. Those are the more fantastical, ginormous enemy versus tiny little Kratos. But when they do pit Kratos against a like-sized foe, I find those almost more engaging. I guess that's something that I really prefer in boss battles. I would rather fight someone who is of similar stature, of similar size than, the common spectacle that most boss battles have become, where you've got this 100-foot hulking monster that's supposed to really impress you, and frankly, a lot of times it just doesn't impress you because you're so used to games like a Bioshock 2 that places the big sisters randomly throughout the world, and you're seeing these huge, ominous foes consistently throughout the game that a giant boss just doesn't do much anymore. Here's Squashini, and he's actually the most creative boss in all of Epic Yarn, and I got some tips for you because he's one that I couldn't figure out on my first try. He varies of his attacks and is actually the only boss in the game that doesn't telegraph a specific pattern. So I think the most difficult one is probably the hats here, and not in the sense that it damages you, but in terms of how do you know where he is. And it's actually not that first hat that drops. That's not where he is. Actually, it's kind of deceiving in that way. But what you have to do is, if you see the little Wild D's in the very forefront of the screen, if you look where they are looking, that's where Squashini is hiding. And that's the easiest way to grab him. And expedite the battle process here. Patterns are something that have also sort of gone away from games, and kind of why I'm really enjoying the bosses in the new Castlevania, because they are pattern-based, a lot of them, and while that kind of this is kind of a crazy moment here. There's no way to damage him during this little portion here, but it's goofy nonetheless. And something I really like about pattern-based bosses is how you can play them, multiple times and feel like you're actually improving, feel like you're gaining ground and learning the system and using your skill to actually defeat the boss. And not to say that current games aren't skill-based, they definitely are, but if you look at something like Infamous, yeah, there's some, quote-unquote boss-type things that you're fighting, but really they're not requiring you to get any better at any set techniques. And with pattern-based bosses, they're pushing you to excel in a certain area. And actually, this is a kind of a funny little glitch in the game here. Somehow this card sticks on the screen, and so I'm able to get 2 hits in on this one little roulette spin, and we're actually able to finish him off rather quickly there. So that was quite good. I'm not sure if it's because I got hit by the card and then it dropped, or how that occurred. Here we have Capamari, who is kind of a cool boss. He does employ a bit of a different method than some of the others. You're required to pull off his little knitted cap, which I really enjoy. And I get hit quite a few times here, but it's because I am really aggressively trying to pull off his cap. And I sped up this battle because it was one of the more time-consuming ones, if you can call 4 minutes time-consuming, but in efforts to fit everything into one 15-minute chunk, we had to make a few sacrifices, so we're going to speed through Capamari here. With a lot of modern titles, I think that the spectacle boss has kind of replaced the challenging boss, and that may seem obvious in the sense of, oh, they got these great graphic engines and all this horsepower that they want to use, but I think believability is something that's incredibly important when looking at how successful a boss is. You take the ending of Gears of War 2, I think the statute of limitations is up on the ending of that one, but after this gigantic, emulsion Brumac has taken out the entire, Locust army, you blast him with 1 or 2 shots and he's dead. It just doesn't, I don't know, it doesn't gel very well. And there's some other good examples of that as well. You've got Mass Effect 2, the ending there, you fight a huge, kind of goofy end boss, and he's supposed to be this master of destruction, and you take him out in a few mere minutes. And to me, that's why believability and fighting bosses of similar size is so important, because I would much rather fight a challenging boss that I feel that I can legitimately defeat with my, in-game character, than some ginormous, crazy, oh my god, he's huge, monster that doesn't really make sense. Here we have King Dedede, and yeah, Kirby's a goofy game, but it's a good example of Kirby's not fighting a ginormous beast, he's just fighting a guy who's a little bit taller than him, and it seems like, okay, this little Kirby fluffball guy could take out this pudgy little king, and it makes sense, consciously, subconsciously. I just feel that when you start putting in these ginormous displays, things that are just trying to be so impressive, you can lose sight of why bosses were fun in the first place. And King Dedede is not one of the more fun ones in Epic Yarn. He's got these puppet strings that you can see that are off the top of the screen. You can't see them when you're fighting him. It makes it very difficult to know where you're supposed to jump and throw your little yarn lasso up. And I miss quite a few times, and therefore we've sped this video up as well. I could not ever get a perfect run of this guy. There's just seems to be, it's based on timing, you have to wait for these puppet strings to come down, and there you go, there's another miss. And they really only drop for half a second, a very split moment, and Kirby's kind of a slow and docile little dude, so he doesn't have the most finesseful jump. And I'm not saying that every game needs bosses, I think a lot of games are probably much better off without them. To have a big dude looming behind a door doesn't make a lot of sense either, he's just sitting there waiting for you. And back in the PS1 and N64 era, something that I always really wanted was a game where the bosses would come and find you, as opposed to just sitting ever so patiently and waiting for your arrival. And we've kind of gotten that with games like BioShock and some of the more open world titles that do have roaming bosses, or creatures that you can encounter. They're much stronger than anything you're intended to fight at that point in the game. And so I don't really know from there where you can go with bosses. I think that's part of the issue. I'm sure game developers struggle equally with that. What do you do if you don't want to have the big menacing foe behind a door? Then you go for something that's roaming, and if something that's roaming doesn't feel as epic, then what are you supposed to do? And I guess that's why a lot of games have resorted to events to sort of be the culminating moment of their games. And I think the two Left 4 Dead titles are great examples of that. You know, you don't have some ginormous zombie that you fight at the end of each level. You have an encounter, and that encounter is intense and crazy, and probably much more memorable than any boss zombie that they could have stuck in there. And Red Dead Redemption ends with a great moment. It's not a boss battle. It's not you're taking on the Mexican army. It's just a great moment. Mass Effect 2 almost ended with this super epic scene. I don't really think that they needed that final little boss in there. I think it would have been stronger with that moment. So maybe that's where we're headed, is events. You know, at the beginning of this video, I said that I really wish there was more bosses, but maybe I don't. You know, I'm not really pleased with a lot of the current crop of bosses, and as I just mentioned, I don't really know where we can go from here. I think bosses are great in games like this, these, you know, 2D side-scrollers, Mega Mans, Kirby's, Mario's, things like that. Yeah, bosses make a lot of sense. But in, you know, major AAA 3D experiences, I don't know how much they really factor in anymore. I think the, you know, cool event may be the way that games have to go, because I guess I don't feel that a big dude behind a door is really a worthwhile ending for a 20-25 hour game that you'll find these days. But Kirby doesn't care about that. Kirby places a boss right at the end of the game. We've got Yin-Yarn, and initially here, you think you're about to face off against all the bosses again. And this is the longest boss battle in the game, and therefore we have sped this one up as well. But as you can tell, the patterns are different. It does no good to throw these things at Fangora. Instead, we have to avoid throwing them at him. See, there we go. His tongue, now we realize his tongue gets stuck out when we get rid of all the rocks and then pull him. Boom, now he's gone. Which is a nice little twist, and this is actually a very clever part here. You need to use his little yarn daggers to jump and reach the exit, and it kind of mixes a lot of different gameplays of going behind the screen, of pulling on things, of swimming. Everything's all put in play here at this very last battle. Capamari comes back. I'm not sure there's anything different here. You're still picking up the guys and, you know, grabbing his nose, but focusing more directly on the game that we have here at hand, Kirby's Epic Yarn is absolutely fantastic, and I think it's a must-buy for anyone that has a Wii. It is not difficult at all. You probably won't die. In fact, you can't die. If you fall off the screen, you just get pulled back up by a little yarn angel. And some people may find that unsatisfying to go through a game without any challenge, but what you're looking for here is to appreciate the world, to appreciate the art, to appreciate the design, and they've got some spectacular creativity going on all throughout the game. Boss battles, regular levels, so many clever moments. The transformations are all awesome. You know, you transform into a dolphin and a tank and a spaceship, and I don't want to spoil all of them because some of them are just superb. But it's all in all, an amazing game. And here we have a good little trick premature ending, and get one more tussle with Mr. Yin-Yarn. And as we wrap this up, I'd like to know your thoughts on bosses. Do you like where bosses are going at this point in the game industry, that there really aren't very many anymore and it's more spectacle and event based, or would you rather have more of these kind of bosses where you walk into a room and here's the creepy foe that you've been dreading the entire game? There's definitely something to be said for that. So what are your thoughts? Let me know in the comments if you like more bosses or if you're cool with the scripted events, and also what some of your favorite bosses are. Here things get really crazy and we're kind of just mashing on the button to finish off Yin-Yarn. There's not much to dodge. You're kind of in a slow, immovable tank. So all we're going to do is pound away. He's blazing bullets all over the place. And as we wrap up this boss gauntlet, hope you found it enjoyable and got some good tips if you're having any trouble with any of the bosses. But I want to thank you very much for watching, and until next time, we will see you later.
Bye.